Welcome everybody to another episode of The Partnership. This is a Christmas themed episode and the last one of the year. So I'm really excited to have an incredible guest on, Josh Greene from AWS. Thanks for joining us, Josh.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this one has been a long time coming. I'm glad we reconnected again at the last PL meetup here in San Francisco. That was in November at the Okta office. If you're in San Francisco, we're actually hosting another meetup next week as well. It's going to be a Christmas themed meetup as well downtown, which I'm pretty excited about. So that's going to be another opportunity to hang out before the end of the year. I see we have a couple of members in the audience I want to give a shout out to. We have Carrie, who's joining us from Toronto, Canada. Thanks for joining us, Carrie. And we have Simon. Good to see you again, Salman. Perfect. So let's start a little bit about you, Josh, and just tell us a little bit about like what brought you to AWS specifically. Like, what's your background? What brought you there? And then which team you're working on right now?
Sure. Well, it's been a 20-year career building out sales teams, business development teams, channel teams, from startups to resellers. And I was really intrigued by what I saw as this opportunity with Marketplace. And we had tried to do something like this at a prior company. And after, fits and starts, I was looking at the industry. I thought, if anybody's going to figure this out, it's going to be AWS. And I'd always wanted to work with a number one in an industry. So I call it the Goldilocks. I actually interviewed with Amazon 3 times, AWS 3 times before it was the right job, the right fit. They liked me, I liked them, but I was hired onto the Marketplace team back in July of 2019 as kind of the first Marketplace development manager. And what that meant was I had a portfolio of 10 partners that were just in the process of starting to embrace Marketplace. And it was a high learning curve role. And then over the last, 5 years, I built out a Marketplace development management function. And that function did get adopted and kind of scaled globally. And then just as of this last year, I took a new role, leaving the Marketplace development management function and focused in the Marketplace seller experience team. So what that means is we look at all of the things that our sellers, which are typically ISV or industry partners or resellers, what they need to be more successful leveraging Marketplace to help them accomplish their goals. So for the past year, I've been working on that. It's more of a strategy job, trying to take some of the best practices and implementing them to help a broader swath of partners be successful.
Got it. I love the persistence, like 3 attempts to join AWS. That I love how you were like so laser focused on like this is the one which I need to land, which makes a lot of sense because that's how a lot of startups feel about AWS as well. Such a big player in this industry. Before we dive in further, I want to give a quick shout out to Ted, who joined us from Oakland. We have Latif as well. The Bay Area like PL chapter is showing up in full force. Appreciate you taking the time today. And then we have Fraser as well. And then we have Joe as well joining us today as well from Raleigh, North Carolina. So full house this morning. Really appreciate you all taking the time. When you talk about the seller experience team, can you give us a couple examples of like what kind of changes you've implemented or what like strategies you've implemented in order to help startups or Amazon AWS sellers be more successful with the marketplace?
Sure. Well, it really started with things that we learned. And I think in hindsight, we call this pattern recognition, but learning this the hard way, what was going to work, what was not working. So when I started, I was working with partners like Snowflake and Databricks and CrowdStrike. And there were some incredibly motivated and bright people on those teams that also wanted to make this work. So from some of those key learnings, a set of best practices emerge from that, which we call internally and now externally the characteristics of a successful seller. And that really was the acknowledgement and kind of validation. These are the best practices that help partners be successful. So when you break those down, there are different elements to them. And so just to take, one example of something that my team has been working on is, we do leverage incentives as a way to try to encourage the adoption of Marketplace to overcome, this is our first purchase, this is our first, whatever. So there are a number of different funding programs that exist within AWS based and Marketplace, but based on some of the experiments that we see, when we could leverage an incentive, all of a sudden we could get more buy-in from sales teams. All of a sudden we could get more buy-in from customers. And so these were never intended to be, long-term kind of discounts, rather a shot of adrenaline to get things going. And what was exciting was this was giving fuel to sales leaders to say, this is why we want to try doing something different. And all of a sudden, as a result, we'd see growth in shared pipeline with AWS. We'd see sales acceleration statistics. So incentives would be an example of one. Another example would be, my team's been really close with prioritizing all of the feature requests that are coming in for how can we continue to iterate on Marketplace. So we're a feeder mechanism that racks and stacks the various feature requests that come in, work with other teams to prioritize those, and then we engage with the engineering team to make sure that we have a proper review of that. So that involves, our feature request process, but also doing roundtables with ISVs to go ask them, what do you need? And so we're always listening to them and participating. My team does that as part of that, but we also partner with a number of teams, really across the globe that help us accomplish that.
Yeah, that's incredible. There's so much to unpack there. I think like one is the incentives. I think not enough people spend like enough time on figuring out the incentives for a partner
Mhm.
as well as their sellers internally, and that's where oftentimes the mismatch is. Like oftentimes people approach partnerships just isn't like, can you send me leads? And then the other side will be like, well, can you send me leads? And that's it. So I think like that's probably the most crucial part to figure out. But I do think it's important to understand as well, like that something like this shouldn't be a crutch, right? Like especially discounts or spiffs or something like that should probably be like more a way to like kickstart a conversation and kickstart a motion rather than something that a company wants to rely on full time and like just give that out to every single partner.
Well, that's the risk. The risk is that something that was intended to be out of a drum becomes recurring and an evergreen incentive that exists, and then it really loses the way that you're trying to help influence adoption in some way. So there's a fine balance in there, and I'd say there's always more demand for incentives than you actually have incentives, and I believe that the wider that you go, the poorer the ROI becomes. So we're really successful, and one of the great things about this business transacting through Marketplace is it's not inferential data, it's discrete data. You can track how long it takes a deal to get closed. You can track the average deal size. You can track conversion rates relative to other things. So I always say, Marketplace is also this great big cash register or computer that collects all this data that you can study, and that is the fodder that you need to help the cycle continue. So that's been a huge advantage. Whereas there's lots of incentive programs that I've been a part of with prior companies, and also here, where it's a little bit more difficult to discern what is the ROI of this actual program.
Yeah. That's so important. And I think like, yeah, AWS is probably better set up than anybody else to like make sure that you're able to attribute and like understand where people are spending, where the budget goes and so forth, as compared to some of the other startups that you and I have worked at where it's much harder to understand where customers are actually spending their money and what the ROI is of each incentive that we provide. I do
Yeah,
want to give a quick
yeah.
shout out as well to Joshua, who's joining us from Israel. So we have our first or yeah, I believe our first overseas audience member. So thanks for taking the time, Joshua. I know it's late for you. And then we have Christine as well, who's joining us from the Bay Area as well. Great to see you, Christine. Um, I want to switch gears a little bit because, like, from the audience members that we see here, like with Latif, Joe, Simon and others who I know well, I know that a lot of them work at startups, and I get approached a lot about like startup partnerships with AWS because it's such a hot topic right now. Like, how can I partner with the AWS marketplace? How can I be promoted by AWS sellers and so forth? So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about like the type of startups that AWS is interested in partnering with. Like, what makes a great partner for the AWS marketplace?
Yeah, I think to unpack this one, and I'll preface this by saying, most of the work that I've been doing is with mid and large size companies, but we do overlap with a number of other teams that have really developed their own set of best practices, some of which interweave with ours. But for the startup
Yeah.
community, number one, I would say this goes back to Amazon and our leadership principles. Like, customer obsession is number one. So if you have a solution that's solving a problem that customers are having, and ideally, that solution also has some type of interaction with AWS and or AWS services. That's that's a great scenario to be in. So solve a problem that our customers are having that is unlocking something for them. Whether that's, ideally that's something around growth, it's something around security. It could be anything. I'd say historically, if you look at there's some great analysts out there that are analyzing the data, and they look at the business by different industries. Infrastructure and security and observability, that was really the first area that took off in marketplace. But if you look at some of the more recent trends, it's, business applications is really growing. So in the past, I would say it's very, very hard to get traction, or it was more difficult to get traction if you weren't one of these kind of security type players or a data and analytics player. But that has changed a lot, and we're seeing dramatic growth across other categories as well as industries as well. So we're talking about, I was talking to a fintech company yesterday. I was talking to a marketing company, the other day. But I think if you're solving a problem, that's number one. Being an AWS customer, that's going to help a lot. So being an
Yeah.
AWS customer that's growing also gives you a key stakeholder here. So now you have an account executive that's really an account manager that's really on your side, trying to figure out how they can help you grow. And I've seen a pretty significant shift in the past 5 years about how AWS account managers engage with their customers to do more go-to-market activity and support, because they know that if they can create, help support logo generation, that's going to lead to more consumption. So of course, that's what we are interested in here, but solving customer problems, being an AWS customer. And if you have, I would say the third thing is, if you have a really concise and sharp, better together story, that would be ideal. And I get that question all the time. And I've shared some of the presentations that have been done on a topic in the past, but those are some things that I look for.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. It's interesting that you mentioned that like it has expanded over the last couple of years, because I
Mhm.
guess in my mind, like, I think the first time we met was at a Bay Area meetup where we talked about AWS co-selling and so forth. And in my mind, it sounded a little bit like a company like, for example, StreamYard and Opus Clip now, where I'm at. Like, it might not be a good fit because our audience are marketing teams who might not be browsing the AWS marketplace, or who might not understand, you know, the AWS marketplace as like a vehicle to like purchase software as well, right? In my mind, it was always just the IT team, and like specifically maybe the data analytics team, who would be the ones who browse the marketplace and like, go to market, like who you could target together with AWS. Is that still accurate, or would you say like it actually has expanded beyond that, and now other teams like the marketing team or other buyers are interested in buying solutions for AWS marketplaces as well?
Yeah, I would put it a couple different ways. Like to plug your book, like you talked about this in your book,
Yeah.
like being very, very aware of what you want out of the relationship. And there you go. There you go. Right back here.
Yeah. Yes, I
Be
see
very
it. I mean, we got a comment in the audience as well from Joe. Great book in
good
the
at.
center of
Yeah,
Joe's show. If you
it's
don't
always
have a
been there.
Christmas present, just like while we're plugging it, if you don't have a
It-
Christmas present, it's a great Christmas present for the whole family. My mom finally understands what I do at work. Like,
There you go. Available
after
on
reading it,
Amazon.
it's written in very basic, and yeah, I read it to my baby daughter as well. She falls asleep every time. Works like a charm. Just saying, for the whole family.
Well, I made it halfway through so far, but it is available on Amazon, so I like that plug. But
Yes.
I think going back to your question, being very aware of what you're trying to accomplish from the partnership is important. And I think when I started, there was this belief that if you build it, they will come. I mean, if you build a listing on Marketplace, customers will just show up and start knocking on the door. And it's just not the case. Like that's not the
Yeah.
case. And we've been dispelling that myth for a long time. Now, what does work, or what can you get out of this is a different question. I would say the existence and the awareness of AWS Marketplace has grown dramatically across different buyer personas. But a CMO probably not getting out of bed in the morning and saying, "I'm going to go find my next whatever on the marketplace." But the availability of it, and the procurement team's understanding of it, and the governance aspects of it, and the ability to tap into this kind of committed spend, cloud spend budget has been huge. So I think you've seen these announcements that have been coming out around Salesforce is in marketplace, and ServiceNow is in marketplace, and Adobe's in marketplace, and a number of other companies that were never really what I would say in our sweet spot have really aggressively moved and are driving a lot more awareness to different buyer personas in the past. So I'm thrilled that the diversity has grown from buyer personas and categories that are represented in marketplace, because that's what really drives the selection. That's what drives more buyers. But I will say that there are partners that do a great job of co-marketing with us to drive people to like the PLG motion that we support with Marketplace. Mongo would be a great example of that. Databricks just made a big announcement of that. So they definitely exist out there, but that's not the number one reason. Discoverability of your product is probably not the number one reason why they're coming.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah, definitely. I think like AWS in like a lot of startups and like scale ups mind is probably like such a big company and like such a like there's so many potential buyers on the marketplace that you would assume that like that is going to help you with discovery, and just by being listed there, like you're going to have like a leg up. But there's so much more work which has to go into this partnership as well in order to make it successful, rather than just listing and hoping that like something big will happen. So I want to flip the question in around. Like, how do I, as a startup, know that the AWS marketplace is right for me, and like, what is like the main benefit I get out of joining the marketplace?
Yeah. Well, when I started and I was building up my team and I was teaching them, here's what I've learned so far. Like every startup, every company we work with, at the end of the day, they want to grow and they want to be more efficient. And those are the two things that they're looking for from this partnership. They want to grow, either get new logos, expand with existing ones. They want to do a better job of retaining their customers. And you talk about some things, some of the elements in their book, and also they want to be more efficient in how they transact. And so that's the language that we need to translate to them. So to me, I think there is an element for a startup of saying, hey, there's a certain amount of referenceability and credibility that exists if I'm in marketplace that might not exist otherwise. And so there's concern, there's risk if a large enterprise buys hypothetical startup's product. So there's some legitimization of that business, because we do have a process with which we vet partners that are coming and getting listed in the marketplace. So I think that's an element that we hear quite a bit. Yes, there are discoverability elements to it, and there are co-selling benefits that exist as we develop this kind of better together story that they can rely on. So can we open doors that might be blocked to you? Can we give you access where you don't have it, if you're explaining that we're going to solve a customer problem that exists out there? But it's not easy. Like I think the big challenge that startups have also is they need to go really fast, and they want to do things really fast and really quickly, and they want scale. And in my experience, that hasn't necessarily been the winning play. It's more, how do I build something, learn something about works, we can A/B test, and then we find repeatability, and then we don't waste a ton of energy on other things, because at a startup you only have a finite amount of resources to go tackle these things. So this had better be one of the top 2 or 3 priorities at the company if you want this if you want this relationship to work.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. Um, there's so many good things in that. I have so many more questions, but I'm seeing that we're getting so many questions in from the audience that I do want to open it up to questions from the audience right now. Before we do that, I want to give a shout out to Latif. Latif bought the book for his entire team and gave it out as Christmas presents. That's great. We have Brianna in the audience who loved the book plug and said it's a great book. Great to see you again, Brianna. And then we had Simon in the audience who just bought the book. Appreciate it, Simon.
Look at that conversion rate. What can marketplace do for you? It can increase book sales. That's good.
Apparently, it can increase book sales. And then Lincoln had a good point. Great to see you, Lincoln from the UK. Nail it before you scale
Oh, I
it.
love that.
That's a good point where it's like make sure that you understand your ICP, make sure that you understand like this is a good fit, and then build on the marketplace for credibility and scale. I like
I
that.
literally I had that
Um,
conversation yesterday, Franz, with a very large successful company, and the great news was the conversation had changed from 5 years ago, where it was tell us what to do, to now understand a little bit about what we need to do. But they said craft, not cobble, and I said that's kind of like curate what the experience, which makes me think that comment that was in there about nail it, then scale it. But like, let's get very focused. Let's stack the deck in our favor on what we think is going to work, so we can show some wins and build some momentum.
yeah, craft not cobble. That's gonna go on a T-shirt at some point.
I don't want to give away the
Great
bar,
idea.
but that apparently that's a mantra internally there.
Yeah, that's awesome. We have a question from Joe. What's the best way to gain visibility and relevance with AWS sellers if you're new to the marketplace? Like we talked about discoverability not being like a key benefit. So how do you make sure that you get in front of the AWS team and like get attached to some deals in the future as well?
Yeah, well, it's going to help if you have a PDR or PDM, a partner development manager resource. Like if you're not there yet, hopefully you have an account manager to help you navigate this. But I was presenting at a Gen I startup, and there was a presentation from one of my colleagues around building a really strong, better together story. I think that's critical, and we see a lot of partners that say, a number of different things, but as a startup, you got to be really specific on the use case that you solve better than anyone. Hopefully better than anyone. And that can't be where, we're like Splunk, but smaller. Like that's not going to work internally here. So telling that specific better together, story and what that very first use case is that you think you knock out of the park that aligns to some of the things that that the AWS teams care about are important to customers. I'd say that's number one thing, and we see that all the time. And sometimes I see these like better together stories. It's too involved. Like we're the average account manager or solution architect, it doesn't have the time to invest to figure that out at the very beginning. So what you're trying to get is a beachhead of 3 to 5 to 10 wins. So you'd have some referenceability. You could say, look what we're doing in Southern California region, working with oil and gas, or look how we're working with this other group. And that is, I think, the best way to kind of daisy chain together success.
Yeah. Build out the case study first. I get that. So like the assumption would then be like you probably as a startup have to put in the effort first, right? Like you can't join the marketplace and go like, can AWS send me my first deal and then I show you how well we do? It's probably the other way around where you have to like prove that you're gonna drive like significant revenue or that you have like a certain segment that you're very good at. And then you can take those case studies and show them to the AWS team.
Yeah, I've used this before, but I think sometimes what happens is there's this expectation that it's going to be some sort of new logo machine. And in my experience, that hasn't been the case, almost unilaterally, right? And
Mhm.
one of the ways that some of our partners seek to help accelerate getting case study wins together is by working on expansion opportunities with AWS. Hey, we're working with one department, but we're trying to do a multi-department deal. So those expansion opportunities, well, that's incremental ARR to you if you land it. It's not technically a new logo, but going back to how do I find success and find areas where there's overlap that doesn't require that much lean in. I think with the way that we've approached the changes to marketplace and listing fees over the time, that used to be a more significant financial penalty to a company. And now if you're talking about doing a renewal through marketplace, you're talking about a 1.5% listing fee, which is all public now. So I think the equilibrium has come saying we are not going to assess that much of a fee, but we can help build a win together if you engage on some of those opportunities. So I've seen it happen a lot as a way to gap up in terms of getting wins to help become more relevant to AWS and our customers.
Yeah. That's a great point. And it seems to resonate really well with the audience. Here we have Carrie say, share every opportunity via co-sale, have your AWS service pull through story well crafted, and yes, build momentum. And I think that's such an important point. It was one of the questions I had as well is like, how do you build momentum? Like, how do you like turn like a one-off into like maybe something where you become like, the go-to resource as an ISV for that specific category?
Yeah. Well, I think to build on what Carrie's comment here is, I mean, you can share every opportunity with us for co-sell, and and that will improve sort of the visibility around the volume of shared opportunities. I think there's also, and hopefully Carrie hasn't experienced this too much, but that doesn't come with the expectation necessarily that AWS is going to jump on every opportunity that exists and add value to that, which kind of brings us to a point of, and we were talking about this in prep, but when you reach out, have a specific question that AWS can actually help you with and answer. And that can't be, can you get in front of the CEO of, Pfizer? That's not going to happen. But if it's, I'm working on an opportunity, hoping to close by the end of December. Right now, we're stuck in this department. Do you have any contacts that we might be able to tap into? Or, we can't disclose how big a private pricing agreement is. There are certain things we just can't say. So put yourself in a position for us to say yes to something that we can actually help with. I think is a really important part of that.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, you gotta have, like, a realistic action item. Like, oftentimes, like, it happens in
Yes.
sales and partnerships in general as well, where, like, partners would reach out to you and go like, "Can we do something together?" And you're like, "This is too vague. Like, I don't know what to do based off this." Like, you need to be, like, much more specific and make it easier for me to help you, so I can actually then perform that task rather than, going in and putting all the work on me to, like, figure out what I can do for you.
Yeah.
Um, one of the things which really stands out to me is like all the love AWS is getting from the audience here. We have Joshua who's saying that like in the Martech space, more and more companies are joining the marketplace right now. So that's a great signal as well. We have Carrie saying like when you buy a third-party SaaS tool from for a marketplace platform, the first question my procurement asks is it available in AWS? So there's definitely this share of mind of like, we can buy it through the marketplace and we should buy it through the marketplace. Um, One question we had here from Fraser is, do you see any common patterns or ISV best practices regarding dedicated headcount to run a scalable marketplace GTM motion? Is this something where you need to have dedicated headcount, or is this something which, the partnerships team can run as one of many partnerships?
Yeah. I mean, it depends on scale and what you're looking for and where this ranks as a priority. Actually, as part of the framework that we talked about, the characters of a successful seller, um, having a dedicated owner is going to help a lot. I know that not every startup can do that, but I think this notion of, if you think about it, if you're a traditional B2B company, maybe like that gentleman was from, and you have sales reps that are out there, and they're part of the hearts and minds of who we are trying to win over to embrace something new. We're used to doing direct, or we're used to doing channel. We aren't necessarily used to doing marketplace yet. So what a dedicated team or a dedicated resource helps you to do is abstract the need for every sales rep out there to understand all the nuance that goes into this. Do I think that all of our startup AEs that exist, it could be 2, it could be 10 or whatever, we want to expose them to, the of sharing opportunities with ACE and what it means to co-sell and how an AWS person gets paid? Like, no, run that through an expert, or, so a dedicated person if you can. That's been the best practice that we've seen. Now, as you build, this becomes a more mainstream function that might move into RevOps or other areas as you grow. But I'd also seen the issue where now we've got the marketplace person, but they're not goal aligned with the channel team that exists out there. So now we've created channel friction. So I think that take a step back and think about, how exactly do we want this to work? Is this a direct motion, we're adding marketplace? Do we have a channel motion, and now we're also embracing marketplace? So we communicate and align the goals to eliminate the friction that will undoubtedly come up if we don't get this right. But to be really specific, we also have some guidelines for suggestions on the first kinds of roles to hire. If that would be helpful, we can probably put that in the comments or something afterwards.
Yeah, that would be incredibly helpful. I mean, there's a lot of interest in like the characteristics of a successful seller framework, as well as like the guidelines on what roles to hire. Um, One thing which we discussed, and I wanted to bring this up because we're heading towards the end, but I want to make sure that we get it is in the book we actually discussed the 5 types of partnerships,
Mm.
and you mentioned that there's a big overlap between this pyramid of the 5 types of partnerships and how it aligns to the internal org and your characteristics of a successful seller framework. If you want to elaborate a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, you've got a pyramid. We've got 6 pillars, but I think the important thing is, particularly if we're talking about the startup audience, but really any size, organization out there. It could be private equity backed, it could be public company, but to really make the AWS relationship work well, it's going to take some lean in, from the top. And at a start, I would say this, it can be one of the most strategic alliances that you have. So if it's not CEO, and hopefully it would be, then the CRO and certainly the SVP of partnerships, and as we go down here, the chief product officer, all these people are involved in this process. And like, aware is one thing, but engaged and participating is optimal. And we're trying to, we see partners trying to build relationships with the AWS, counterparts, but that's most relevant. And I know that a company is real about this when they're bringing the right level of executives to an EBC or a QBR or reInvent meeting, et cetera. If they're not showing up, that's kind of an indication that this may not be that big of a priority. And our probability of success making that partnership yield what we want for the partner, typically additional, revenue growth, is suboptimal. So we do kind of touch on this in a different flavor in the cost model that we talked about, but it's in there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the main takeaway is that AWS partnership is an alliance level effort. Like it requires for especially as a small startup, but also medium-sized startups to have like full leadership alignment and to have everybody on board to make sure that you can actually put in the effort required to succeed. Because if you're just one partnership manager trying to do this on yourself by yourself and like trying to like you run your normal partnership motion, it's probably not going to work. It will take a lot of effort in order to succeed at the scale that you want to succeed at with a partner like AWS.
Well, yeah, and I think the points are just there. They've come. So you mentioned, customer service, that's in there when we started talking about renewals, and the product team, that's in there when we talk about the PLG motion or things that we need to do, or how do we get the dimensions to fit our listing type. Like it's in there. And so, there's a lot of teams that can block, success from happening, being apathetic about what the goal is. So I think that alignment is critical.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we're hitting up at time. Kerry already had to leave us. Thank you for joining us today. Before we head out, I do want to ask one last question. What do you wish startups would do more often when they approach the AWS Marketplace team? Is there one thing that stands out where you're like, if you do this one thing better, like you have a higher chance of success?
Well, I think we touched on it before. First of all, I think startups generally, like startups is like a population. There's so much marketplace expertise that exists that we started 5 years ago. And there's so many more resources and places and destinations to get information about this. That's one of the things that's been kind of blown my mind over the last 5 years. It's just how much more mainstream this has become in the last 5 years. So what I think used to be secrets now are more readily available for those partners, for those companies and startups that want to do a little diligence, like attending something like this or a meetup or whatever. But I would say, for me, having a clear idea about what you want from the partnership and demonstrating that really specific better together story. If you just did those two things, I think more success will come.
Awesome. Have a clear idea and a great better together story.
There you
That's a
go.
great way to wrap up the show. Normally, I shout out everybody who joined us at this point, but so many people joined us today. There's such interest in the AWS marketplace. So I won't be able to do that, but really appreciate you all taking the time. Josh, if somebody wants to follow up on like the cost model and on learning more about the marketplace, where can they find out more and where can they get in touch with you?
Sure. Well, we met on Partnership Leaders, so that's a good spot if you're a part of that community. Obviously, you can reach out on
Yes.
LinkedIn. I will probably redirect people to other folks that are within the organization, but Partnership Leaders is one. LinkedIn would be the second.
Awesome. And if you're in the Bay Area, 18th of December, we have our next meetup, final one of the year. Really looking forward to seeing everybody there. And with that, this is a wrap for the last episode of the year. We'll be back next year with more episodes of The Partnership. See you then.
Hark now, mates, lend an ear.
Hear us now.
Captain Franz at the helm so steer. Gather round the partnership's deck.
Scripts command.
Tales from the leaders of the partnership train. So we chant by the podcast glow. Through veritable seas to boxes flow. Dar-o-die. Hoist the sail.